And then try logging into this one.
I know it's coming. And the link to like what? Oh.
Okay, so here's go to Zoom. Let's see. 813. Huh?
It's not coming.
I'm here. Shall we begin?
Yeah.
Apologies to all the viewers at home for the technical difficulties. On behalf of the Northeast American Diocese of the Malankar Orthodox Syrian Church, good evening and welcome. My name is Sunil Kurian. I'm a former council member of the American Diocese of the Malankar Orthodox Syrian Church. I currently reside in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I put my business and legal backgrounds to work for a Fortune 50 telecommunications company. As we all know by now, on May 25th in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a Black citizen named George Floyd was killed while being taken into custody by police. Shortly thereafter, a graphic video of his death became public, resulting in widespread protests and outcry concerning police brutality and touching off even broader discussions of racial inequity in America. These are troubling times where our faith requires us as a church to be honest and aware to what is going on in the society around us. This evening, we will be speaking on racial injustice, the church, and how we as Orthodox Christians must break down the walls of racism that separate us. As an administrative point, we will be fielding questions off of our Facebook Live feed, so please feel free to contribute to ensure that we have an interactive and productive session. Before we get started though, I would like to introduce the person who was responsible for setting up this conversation on behalf of the faithful. Aside from the work he does for our church, he holds a significant role in the world of churches. He's an avid reader and a lively contributor on social media. And I'd like to welcome the Metropolitan of the Northeast American Diocese, His Grace Zachariah Nicholovos. Good evening, Tiruveni.
Thank you, Sunil. Good evening.
Tiruveni, I'd like to first express my appreciation to you and the diocese for having the courage to speak on these difficult topics. If the feedback I've already gotten is any indication, it's greatly appreciated, especially by the younger generation. So with your permission, if we could maybe just jump right into it.
Please go ahead. We have lost some time
Yeah.
due to technical
Understood.
difficulties.
So May 25th, as I mentioned, was the day that George Floyd was taken into custody by police, and it resulted into his untimely death. On May 29th, some may or may not be aware, the diocese had issued a statement regarding what had occurred as well as the unrest that was going on. Could you maybe talk about, first off, your impressions of what happened in the George Floyd incident and why you felt it was necessary for the diocese to speak out at that time?
When I think about it, because it was a sad incident, to say the least. To say sad means because the violence of the whole incident. When you look at the incident, when you see a police officer to whom we all look to protect us, when they act, at least he acted in a very gross manner, and his colleagues looked on without taking any actions. So that I felt it was a gross injustice, subversion of justice, and as a church leader, I felt I have to make a statement on the matter because I felt as a disciple of Christ, I'm called to do that.
So within the statement itself, I found it really interesting. And of course, I have a legal background, so words are important, right? You use the phrase, the reality of racism. And I've received questions from people who are viewing this right now who wanted clarification on that. Specifically, we have a lot of conversation going on in society today about institutional racism. Could you maybe clarify what you meant when you said the reality of racism?
There is an institutional nature to the racism. There is a social nature. Then there is a interiorized feelings of racism to both the oppressors and the oppressed. And also to some of us who think that we are bystanders. I want to underline the word think. In this kind of situation, nobody is a bystander because it's only a matter of time when it affects you. So I would say there is an institutional nature to the whole racism where the whole system is lopsided towards the so-called ruling class. And then the society has got this nature of condoning it, trying to look at these kind of incidents as isolated incidents. And if you have, I don't want to use the word if, you have gone through the recent news items, there are groups of people trying to highlight the riots and the looting as general nature of the protests. But on the same time, they don't want to acknowledge the oppression by the police or some other institutional officials as generalize it. So for those, they will say it is isolated. These, they will say generalized. That itself is a racial expression.
Right.
Because they think that the blacks or the people who are trying to protest are by nature violent people. They are looters, but at the same time, the police, I'm just referring to this particular policeman, but also there is a series of incidents where they don't want to acknowledge those are generalized.
Right, right. And it's interesting within that language, when you speak about protesters versus looters, and if you apply that to the police, we've gotten very comfortable with the term a few bad apples, which I think a very prominent Black comedian recently said, I've had a bad apple. The worst that I've had was tart. that's not a good way to describe it. So another thing that I thought was real interesting within that statement that you had was also talking about having the courage to act. And so any of us who are on social media today, especially, I think we've seen a very unique level of outpouring, especially from our young people within our church, regarding everything that's going on. And so when you use the words courage to act, what exactly were you kind of intending, or what did you have in mind when you were suggesting that?
It depends on each individual situation. It could be participating in the protest. It could be writing a letter to the to your senator. It could be supporting some of the organizations that organize these things. So it could be a variety of things. So what I mean is that, as I said earlier, we cannot afford to be a bystander. We cannot afford to have a neutral position, because when injustice is done, there is nothing neutral about it. I would like to use the word, that we should have a preferential option towards the oppressed. You are called to be with the oppressed rather than with the oppressor. And here there's another question, and the courage to act also doesn't come free. It is a costly courage. So that is where it lies. We might end up losing our privileges or paying price for the action we take. So each individual has to weigh, in the context of, especially being a church leader, I would say in the context of the faith, in the context of your church life, how we should act in these kind of situations.
So how would you respond then? So we are a church of many generations, right? And so my parents who came here in the 70s, I was the first generation. For me personally, I'm a second generation, and now my children are the third generation. And so we have different experiences in all of that. How would you, try to classify the relevancy of what's going on with the struggle, frankly, of Blacks in America versus what we're encountering here, or does it have anything to do with this?
Yes, because when we think about your parents' generation, we all know they came here, most of them. They didn't think that they are going to permanently settle here. So they considered themselves as transient people. They came here because of a job situation, got a good opportunity. They thought they will make some money and go back. Now, in your generation, some are born here, some are at least brought up here. So for all practical purpose, you are Americans. But when it comes to your children's generation, they are Americans. Right. They are born.
There's no going back.
Yeah. And because of this attitude, your parents' generation might have thought, I want again to say, might have thought, it is not our struggle. We are not here for long haul. So we will do whatever we came here to do and get out as early as possible. But when you make this country your home, when you raise your children here, and for you, your generation of people, it is your home. It is not merely about whether it affects you or not. It's a question of a society where we live in. So we are invested in the society with not merely investment, not in terms of materials, but with our life. So a peaceful, just society for us to live in and for the future generations is very important. So different generations might look upon these things differently, but we have to have that internal dialogue.
Right, and that's interesting that you say internal dialogue, because even in planning this conversation, and I'm sure you've gotten emails and questions, and I've certainly received them. One of the questions that I received, and it's a fair question, which was, how are you going to talk about things that touch upon the American or the Black American experience, and there's nobody Black within the conversation? And that's a fair question to an extent that I would say. However, I also would say that we acknowledge the pain of that experience. And I think it would actually be a disservice to them to maybe be inauthentic and go and find somebody from the outside to pull them into this conversation at this point, rather than having the internal discussion and then looking outward. And just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think this is an internal discussion. So this is not about how Black, okay, again, then we have to redefine Black. Between you and me, our skin tones are dark enough.
It didn't bother my wife, so it's okay.
Yeah. So basically, what I am saying is, okay, if this conversation is taking place because of our struggle as a community of the Indian Christians or Indian Orthodox Christians, seeing this struggle, this injustice happening, how are we dealing with it? It is not merely about the African American experience of their oppression. It is this dialogue is about our own struggle, seeing this oppression and how we experience the oppression of others, along with the fact that many situations we are also part of this colored group or colored minorities, to use a wider term. So we also undergo this kind of oppression in a different sense or different way. Again, it's not about our oppression alone. It is not a self-serving conversation. It should be about a wider, just how to create a wider, just society where for our future generations and for us to live in. And also we have to understand that only a just society will be able to provide that sense of peace and harmony for all of us. If any group of people, whether it is black, white, or blue, green, whatever it is, are oppressed, as long as that oppression exists, nobody can be at peace.
Right. And so in thinking about that, we have, I think, well, we should acknowledge as a church, we've tried to do different things. We have the mission churches. I'm part of a mission church now. You know, now that we're having this discussion out in the open about race, there was a lot of trepidation or hesitation, let's say, even when those were starting. In terms of what your hopes are for those churches and in factoring into this discussion, how can we be maybe a positive force within that discussion in your mind?
As you are part of being a part of the mission congregation, you also would know that those congregations are the congregations where this conversation is the easiest. In spite of different political ideologies and different things, this conversation is comparatively easy to have. But if you go to your parents' generation to have a conversation on this, and you can easily have a dismissive attitude. It's like that. Oh, why do you bother? Or make sure you are safe. So I would say that is where I would say the importance of the mission congregations were, and also at least in partially at least, many of these mission congregations have that interracial nature. So that also gives us a segue to have that conversation. How we have the people of other ethnic groups welcomed into these congregations, while our other congregations are mostly ethnically Malayali groups. So these are the groups, either through marriage or through conversion or for different reasons, you have a multi-ethnicity, at least at a very, I would say lower level, but still the people who are coming there feel welcomed enough to stay comfortable and be part of that congregation.
So we received a question from the Facebook Live feed. Let's acknowledge that racism is a reality in our church. Hope this brings a change to our church as well. We lost a lot of people who are part of our church because of this. Even now, we are not ready to extend our borders to people outside of Malayali blood. So that's a comment. I don't know if there's a question in there per se. So my experience, speaking strictly as a layperson, I think this is something that a lot of ethnic groups struggle with, right? Like, as you mentioned, a lot of our ancestors at this point who came here to this country did not come here because they wanted to put down roots in America necessarily. They came because they wanted a better opportunity and give their children an opportunity, and they weren't necessarily thinking of that next stage. So I think race has been an issue for us. Interested in your thoughts in terms of even terming it as racism within the church.
I would acknowledge that comment. We are a racist group. I know that I'll get into hot water for saying this. Of course, we will try to cover it up, but we have that attitude. And you have to read it along with our own roots back in India. So most of us who, especially the Orthodox community, are part of the Syrian Christian community, and we were considered, I don't want to go into the history of whether Brahmins or Hazar, but we are, as a group within the caste structure, had the high caste privileges. So because of that, in that sense, within the social context of Kerala, we were a privileged group. I'm not talking merely of economics. There could have been poor people in the Syrian Christians, rich people, but caste-wise, we had that privilege. So we, as a group, Syrian Christians generally thought that it is okay to treat Dalits like that. And there was formally, as a group, the church practiced untouchability. So to the immigrants here, it was very easy to transfer that identity here and consider themselves as whites. Whether whites acknowledge it or not, it's a different question. And look upon the blacks or African Americans as equate them with the Dalits. So you have this internal attitude, it's okay, that is how things are. We can be kind to them, we can be nice to them, but still, okay, that's part how life is.
So we're getting a couple of questions, and I've received some questions even before now that are more politically focused. So specifically, we know right now with the protests that are going on, Black Lives Matter is in the news, not just as a slogan, but as a movement. Does the church actually have a position on the statement Black Lives Matter? Is it simply enough to say all lives matter? Let's kind of start there and kind of we can unpack from there.
Okay, church as an institution hasn't made an official statement on this. Theologically, as far as the church is concerned, all lives matter. That doesn't mean church doesn't support Black Lives Matter movement. I think you might have seen that I have shared on my Facebook wall that I support Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. Because Black lives are important lives which cannot be sniffed out at the will and pleasure of some people. So to answer that question, Black Lives Matter because those are the lives that is in danger currently.
Right. I think it's a real interesting conversation because we, especially within the political discourse, we get hung up on language. Language is such a real difficulty, and we create terms also to minimize those things we disagree with as well. Yeah. I have found in conversations with my colleagues and my friends and even my family members that a lot of times the all lives matter is used to minimize the Black Lives Matter statement. And I think that there is comfort at times in saying all lives matter because it fits in with other language that we know as a country that are as red, white, and blue as America. We the people, all men are created equal. But when you look at the history of this country, it was Blacks who had to continue to remind the framers and the people that came afterwards up through the Supreme Court, legislation, and through other things that yes, when you say we the people should be Black people too. And for those people who have the legal history, the case of Dred Scott, a Supreme Court justice came out and said, those of African descent do not have the rights of US citizens and therefore could be treated as property. And so when you say Black Lives Matter, to me is probably more of a statement completing what this country is founded on by saying, we the people, yes, we've forgotten about it, but Black Lives Matter in that as well.
You also have to, since you talk from your legal background, I can say from my theological background, there was a time when there was a conversation going on in this country whether Black people have souls. So historically, there was a time when these people's human nature was not acknowledged. So even like equality, even the documents were framed. These people were not part of the framers. So we have a great constitution, but the constitution, the people who framed the constitution didn't have Black people included in that conversation. Or they thought that these people are also should be allowed to pursue in the pursuit of happiness and all those kind of narratives. So, but as you mentioned, it took a long history of struggle for these people to reach this point. So even like when you think about our people meaning the South Asians or the Indians or Indian Malayalis or the Orthodox people, whoever we are trying to identify, we were able to come here because of the civil rights movement. Because the visas were restricted to certain groups of people. So we might want to disown that, but at the same time, we also have to know that we are here because of the struggles of these Black people. Otherwise, we would not have been here.
Right, right. So we're getting a lot of questions, which is a good thing to have. So here's a question in terms of how we handle this in our households. So given the language and value barriers, how should the youth in MGOCSM go about having conversations with parents about BLM or about joining protests and potentially dangerous public causes? So if I may really quickly, as you gather your thought, I think that part of it is that as a young generation, and as I've moved out of that phase myself, we do get frustrated when people don't share our passion, right? Like that's there. We are frustrated when people don't see our passion. We also need to recognize, not with anger, but with compassion, some of the ignorance of our older folks. I sometimes shudder a little bit, and I'm a little uncomfortable because I see people getting angry with the older generation because they're not listening, they feel. But there are ways to have these conversations. And I think maybe that's what the person is asking for, is how you have those conversations so that they can act.
Yeah, I think, okay, let me quote my own examples. Because as a youngster, as a college student or something, when I joined the protest movement, I didn't consult with my parents. Because this is certain things youngsters do. Only young bloods will be able to do that. Because as you said, you have grown out of it, you have to work for it, you are worried about your family, you have to think about it, or I am in my position now, I am 60 years plus. And so at this age, I might not do that. But that passion comes with my age also. My own idealism, my own commitment. So I would say, keep the conversation going. At the same time, don't let the passion die. Don't let your seniors pour water over your passion. Keep the light, the fire ignited. At the same time, you also understand from your the earlier generations or previous generations attitude, it is not merely about lack of passion, it is also about they're worried about your safety. Because your parents don't want you to be the next George Floyd. So their argument with you for not allowing you to go to a protest or asking you not to go to if you are past that age of seeking permission is about that. This is something they don't want to happen. They also have that fear in spite of then you also have this in this country or in this context, you also have this whole news reporting, the media system, like it's always, when you think about black criminals or all blacks are criminals, depending on which news channel you watch or which news feed you read. So it is not an easy answer, because the people who don't share your passion are informed differently. That is the current lingo, alternate facts.
Right. Alternative facts.
Yeah, alternative facts. So this is another struggle we have to do. So you have to confront it at an informational level, but then also you can confront at an informational level only to people who think that they need another further information, or they have to look at the other side of the story.
So one of the things, and people are very passionate about their politics. So
yeah.
the first question is one that I received earlier, which was, do we support the Black Lives Matter political movement as a church? And do we also support the various aspects of their platform?
See, as a church, we don't support any political movement. Because as a church, our job is to equip our people to discern for themselves. Because I hope that our people will be able to see through the issues and take their own position. And to answer the question, do the church support Black Lives Matter? This I'm talking also from my personal opinion. I support the whole concept of Black Lives Matter, but not as a political movement. And I haven't even looked deeply into all different aspects of that Black Lives Matter movement. But personally speaking, I like the idea of Black Lives Matter because Black lives are in danger now.
Right, right. And I think one of the challenges, we mentioned young people talking to the older generation, we are passionate and we are well-versed on the issues that matter to us. So we are ready to have a policy discussion, and we're already at 60 miles per hour and the people we're talking to are only at 0. And so if you say justice for everyone sits around and says, great. But then you mention more sophisticated or more complex policy issues, for instance, reparations, or you discuss things such as defunding or abolishing the police. Those are probably much more nuanced that people would want to, I would hope, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I would hope that people who don't share your passion may not just be educated on those things. And maybe that's an opportunity, instead of being frustrated, to begin to educate them a little bit as to why you feel that might be important.
Yeah, I think the education part should go both ways. Because many people who are too passionate about these things, for example, okay, defund the police. What do you mean? At a simple level, I haven't got into all the nuances, but at the first sentence, it would sound to me, should I say that we shouldn't give salaries to the police?
Right.
Because it has got, as you said, it's a policy positions, and it has got nuances. So unless you are able to understand the nuances, we will not be able to make an informed contribution to the conversation. So in that situation, what remains is only the passion and the anger and frustration.
Right. Right. And I think sometimes if we can articulate the pain a little bit more, again, I'm not an expert on things like defunding the police. I can only imagine people have done their thesis and their doctoral work on things such as that, and they've gone on and on. But if you explain the pain, which is, do we generally feel that our criminal justice system is the right way to be pushing all of our problems? I think most people would have a general understanding that, well, I'd like to maybe know a little bit more about that. What do you mean by that? And sometimes I think that's a lost opportunity that we're facing now. In our outrage, we're not willing to have that moment where we explain that.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, but at the same time, because with some information I have, I can easily say our justice system is skewed. So,
I'm taking my own bias out of it, but I would agree.
and also the way I look at it, just reading the newspapers, how the certain, for example, now since the conversation is on black people, how the black people are punished for the same offense in a different way.
Right.
How the police is issuing tickets to people of color. So all those nuances are there. So a simple way, there is a problem with the justice system. So unless we address it, I think and that's not only to even like the white collar, even like the Indian who had that stock issue, he's in jail for a long term.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah. So, and then again, he was prosecuted by another Indian. So, but at the same time, we also see many other whites who have gone through the same similar cases, got away with a fine or something like that. So when people experience this I'm talking at an anecdotal level. So at the same time, as you said, if somebody has done a research on it, that a thesis on it, I would humbly say that I will have to read further on it, be informed myself on it. But at a superficial level, I will say our justice system needs a lot of fixing.
Right, right. It's interesting. So as the Facebook Live comments are coming in, I'm doing my best to try to get them within the flow of the conversation. We're also getting comments. One person, I think, corrected both of us and said it actually means to reallocate federal funds to uplift the community so there is less need for policing. Defund the police is divisive. And they put that in quotes, defund the police. So there you have it. The people have.
That's a good information. And I believe in it. See, for example, now, I don't know whether you have read, like, I think it was Denmark, they are closing down jails. They don't need jails now. Now, a few years ago, when I was in England, there was a big debate on the TV. Should the police constables, or our term officers, regular officers, should have guns with them? So when you look elsewhere, it's a different story. So the world has got different models, not merely this one. So I think it's, if we are able to invest more in the society and the community building, we might not need all the police. And how come, I don't know, what is it, 30% or 40% of the population, of black population is incarcerated? Or how come this country has got the largest number of people in the jail? So you have to link it to the jail labor, who are benefiting from those kind of things. So things get really complicated. And then when you add up all these things, one particular community gets the brunt of all these evils.
Right, right. And again, I tend to be a little bit of an amateur history buff, but you go back and you look at the history, and if you say the Civil Rights Act, I think of 1962, I mean, is that even a generation ago? You know, that so up until then, you have the greater part of America fighting the concept of integration. You know, they want to still continue to keep things segregated.
Yeah.
We celebrated a few days ago Loving Day, which was the day that the Supreme Court issued an edict saying that interracial marriages would be allowed in all states, essentially. So when you have things like that, you're not going to flip a switch and fix all of these problems. I think that needs to be acknowledged of it, is just from a policy perspective. You don't just say people are integrating and then expect it all to happen and there's not going to be any issues. I'm curious to know, in your experience, even from India, you know, certainly we have the caste system there. You know, I know that I spoke earlier, we say we the people here in America. I mean, the Indian Constitution is slightly different than how they started, right?
Yeah. Now, actually, when you look at the Constitution of India, I will say it's an improvement on American Constitution. Because Ambedkar, who was the main force of that Constitution, studied in Columbia, and American Constitution has influenced him a lot. But many of these things, which took a lot of struggle, was originally drafted into the Constitution. For example, untouchability. All those things were legally banned in India from the beginning. But as you said earlier, passing a law or having written it in the Constitution doesn't mean that it has become effective from the next day. So even now it's a struggle for the Dalits and the Adivasis, or means the tribal aborigines. So that struggle is going on. So my position would be, in this context and in the context of India, we have to be partners with the people who are struggling for this. It is not about that whether, like as to borrow your own word, we cannot just turn the switch on and be desegregated, but are we moving in the right direction? Or are we making progress? Or progress enough, fast enough? Or what is the consequence of this kind of brutality against people?
So we're getting a couple of questions, I think, regarding action. And we've gotten a question saying, do we intend to address racial issues in our Sunday schools? Could we please focus on what the Mullingar Orthodox Church will do to address prejudice amongst our own people, to then address our prejudice against the Black community, Sunday school, donations, other things. So in terms of actions as a church or a diocese, I mean, what thoughts are there in terms of how we address these things internally with ourselves, even after we have some of these tough conversations?
Yeah, I would say that because you know how the church has structurally created in such a way that most of this action should come from the local level, because we also think in terms of what is locally actionable. And it will be too difficult for me to write a kalpana saying that all of you go to the next BLM protest march or take any political position for that. But see, Sunday school, our curriculum is, you are aware again, it's basically about the faith matters. But I hope the faith also includes it. When you say that image of God, man or human beings are created in the image of God. It is black, white, and Indian, brown, anybody. So that message has to be made a bit more clear, I would say. And we happen to be, as I said, an ethnic church most of the time. So visibly, we don't have that kind of presence in our churches mostly. But the Sunday school students and the youth movements or NGOCism, and at different levels, they will be encouraged to be open-minded in these kind of things.
So again, we're getting a lot of questions, which I think is a great thing. I'm just looking through here. Are we going to stop ostracism? When will we stop ostracizing Malayalis because they marry out of the family and out of the church?
Church doesn't ostracize. See, when you marry outside the church, okay, now here I'm talking theologically.
Correct.
When you marry outside the church, you leave the church. Because within the canons and the laws of the church, you cannot have a partner outside the church. Church cannot prevent somebody from doing it, but when that happens, we don't ostracize, but they are no more part of the church because they consciously have left the church. And as far as we know that most of the families, at least these days, are not going to ostracize anybody. Most of the time, they happen to, okay, some of the parents might not be happy at the beginning, but soon okay, that is how it is. So I don't, but in Kerala, there may be a little more ostracization, but within this context, I don't think ostracization is a serious problem, but if they are referring to being part of the church after marrying outside the church, because you cannot have it, you cannot have the cake and eat it.
Right, right. And again, maybe I'm starting to show my age, having lived in diocese pretty much all of my life. So I'm in my 40s now. I remember family conferences in the 80s where interracial marriage was a topic many times back then. It's hurtful to think that that's still an issue, but I'd like, you mentioned progress. I'd like to think that we've made some progress on that issue. And if we're not, I'm not sure it's the church. And if it's not the local people in the church.
I think the people, because churches, the laws haven't changed.
Right.
But the people, I think, okay, for example, you have been attending the family conference. These questions doesn't come up anymore.
That's right. That's right. So if we could move to something we didn't really talk about, but as we all know, when we discuss the struggles of our Black brothers and sisters in this country, oftentimes the term used to describe Indian Americans specifically is the term model minority. And it's sometimes used as almost as a weapon to the Black community, against the Black community, and saying essentially, well, here are some folks that came here. They're also of a certain skin pigmentation. They are of a certain socioeconomic class. What's the problem? So I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts on that term model minority? I think we've got some things to be proud of, but aren't there some things that are uncomfortable about that term?
Again, it's a matter of definition. What do you call a model minority? Being a pastor within the community, I know we are not the model of anything. We might have made some economic progress. We might not have high rate of crime like another, but I think also we have other issues. But we cannot compare ourselves to the Black brothers and sisters here. We don't have that history of slavery. We or our ancestors were not dragged out of our own countries in chains, and many of them might have died in transit and spent generations in slavery, and then so-called freedom doesn't provide them anything. So when you compare ourselves or somebody else compare us, the South Asians or others, with Blacks, I think it's a very unjust comparison, because it doesn't do any legitimacy to the struggles or acknowledge the struggles the Blacks have to go through to reach where they are now.
Right. And I think it's interesting if you put side by side the history of the struggle of Blacks in this country, and you look at it, I think, and I tried to do a little bit of research here, I think in 1619, 20 Black slaves were first brought to the Jamestown colony. Yeah. You think about 1619 and you think about the history there, and you think about in 1947, we were given independence in India. Yeah. Right. And we talk about the struggle India has had sometimes amongst our older generation and trying to become a country. And we were under colonial rule for so long. In 1947, when we had independence, the civil rights movement in this country was still taking root, and the Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until the 1960s. And I think when you put those timelines side by side, it gives you pause. And if anything, it gives you some appreciation at least it did for me, of where Blacks have even gotten at this point. That even when these things were passed here, we were sending federal marshals to enforce 6-year-olds to go to school.
Mhm.
We were doing things like that as a country of the United States at a time where in India, we were struggling with independence from the colonials who had,
by 60s we had 47 we had independence, so at the civil right. But as I mentioned earlier, because in India, with the formation of India and the passing of the constitution, many of the things the Blacks have to struggle to get was built into that. For example, equality before the law, untouchability is banned, all those kind of things. So many of those things were built into the constitution at the beginning itself, but again, in practice, it hasn't reached where it should be.
so just in terms of time check, we're at 8 o'clock, but you don't mind staying for a few more minutes to
No.
continue? So one of the questions that we've gotten also is in terms of biblical guidance, in terms of how the lens in which we view these type of issues of justice, injustice, how we deal with other races. Do you have any thoughts in terms of biblical or theological guidance in terms of how we should be viewing these things?
See, the problem with the Bible, I would say, it depends on the reader. It can be used as a weapon against or for. Now we also say somebody was holding a Bible and taking a picture in front of a church and using it as a prop. So, but the basic idea, I would say, from my theological understanding, human beings are created in the image of God. So that is part of the basic ideology or the theology of the church. It doesn't say human beings, meaning you black, white, as I mentioned earlier, whatever color. And also it is repeatedly in Christ, we also see that the Paul says, no, in Christ there is no Jew or Gentile and all those. So within the Christian framework, I think we have to treat all human beings equally, period. But at the same time, historically, this also is a text where Paul referring to how the slaves should be treated, it has been used within American history to justify slavery. Only thing is you have to be nice to them. So those are the distorted ways of using it. Then again, there is a progression. Because even in India, there was slavery, not this kind of slavery, but I would say worse because some of the Dalits were treated as slaves and owned by families, or some were attached to the property. I have seen documents of properties which says that this property is sold along with the XYZ people living in there and their children. So the slavery was there. So at that time, nobody bothered. So there is a progression of human race. Our understanding of humanity changes. But there is a scientific process, a progression of all those things. So the biblical interpretation should go according to that also.
Right. I think speaking simply as a layperson, I've taken some comfort in just looking in how Paul preached to the Gentiles, right? Like they were also not considered to be a chosen people. So there's a lot in that experience that as a layperson, when you read that and you compare the context, I think there's some things to be learned in that. So we received another question. Does the diocese plan to condemn the current president of the United States for past public statements supporting white supremacists and continuous attacks on illegal immigrants, refugees, and minorities in the United States?
Diocese not per se. They are the church as a institution. We are part of a bigger group. So we have sent documents. I have been signatories to the documents that whatever they said has happened. National Council of Churches, World Council of Churches, Church World Service, we have been repeatedly writing to the president, and I have even personally gone to the senator's office for lobbying purpose about many of these issues. And Church World Service is an organization in which I'm on the board, which actively is working with the immigrants. So we are part of a bigger system rather than just isolatedly condemning on those kind of things.
So another question is, understanding that we're in a currently we're living in a very polarized society, and we're having, what I think is a very courageous discussion to have. And again, I thank you for having that discussion. I think there's some courage on behalf of the diocese to have that. What do we think we can accomplish in the near future? Where do we think that we're going to go with any of this? Are we still going to be having discussions, June 14th of 2021? Interested in knowing, because, and I say that partly because I've had professionals who are working, either in the DA's office or the public defender's office, or people in the diversity fields, or people that are in academic settings, who have been asking, what does the diocese, what are they looking to do? And I'm just curious to know, I know you're very much about grassroots, but if there's anything that you have any thoughts, and maybe a year from now.
No, I would rather not do as a diocese on many of these things because of the institutional, and as you said, the diocese is comprised of people of different political affiliations. But so I would not take any political stand on those kind of matters. But as I said again, we can say things about justice. We can say that where do we stand on a justice issue? And to simply answer the question, will we be having this discussion in 2021? I hope so. Because none of these issues will be solved overnight. So the struggle will continue, because the struggle will continue, but my prayer is that it is a progressing line. So we hope that something like George Floyd, or that what is that kid who was killed in near St. Louis, or somebody got killed in Atlanta yesterday.
Right.
I hope that will not happen repeatedly again. But at the same time, the struggle will continue, and the conversation has to go on. And at least my hope for us as a group, as the Malayalis or the Indian Orthodox, as a group, is we become more and more aware of these things and become more and more clear about, in these kind of situations, where should I stand as an Orthodox Christian, as an individual at the grassroots level. So we should have enough people to think positively about those kind of things.
So in terms of, and I think that's good. And one of the conversations I think that you and I had even over the last few days is, what are some actionable items? What can we do? And I think one of the things that you said at that time was, well, let's see what the people want to do. And I find it very interesting. I'll be very curious because this Facebook Live feed is going, and I can't get to every comment. But I think there might be some tangible things that maybe we can come and work with you on to the extent that it is possible.
I would say this conversation should go on at the grassroots level. We should at the family level, and we have to take, and at some parishes you might have to end up saying that what can we do? It might be from simply wearing a badge, just to declare to the world that this is my position, or to go to the next protest, or even to pray, because in the context of injustice, that's a greatest story in the Bible now, the Exodus. In the oppression, that is what God says now. I have heard my people's cry. So as a church, this is something we have to repeatedly raise it to God, the victims of injustice, victims of oppression, because God is a God of the oppressed people who will, because God also is seen as the liberator.
I'm going to combine two questions very quickly here. What is leadership doing to encourage Hutchins and church leaders to have these sort of conversations? And then if these issues are a local parish issue rather than a diocese issue, will the diocese interfere or reprimand if they perform an actionable item?
Depends on, unless, see, these are hypothetical questions. It is like the story. It's like somebody asking the to the confessor, can I confess some of the sins I plan to do? Because it all depends on reprimand. If the reprimand is needed, it might happen. And also, I cannot reprimand according to somebody else wants. I also have to feel that there is a need for reprimand.
Right. But getting back to the earlier point about, are we encouraging Hutchins or leaders to be speaking out on this, or is that that will be happening?
See, yes, actually that's the idea of this conversation itself. I'm personally coming out. And also then there is another, there could be, as you said, the previous generation who thinks that, okay, this is okay, but then that also is a position. I cannot just remove an Hutchins because of his political position.
Right. So I think we're getting some passionate posts that are implying that we, instead of being passive, we should be actively anti-racist on all levels. What are your thoughts?
Aren't we?
Well, I think that's the challenge for, I think that's the challenge for the, not specifically for you on this conversation, but I think to the local Hutchins as well.
And also I would have to say that because again, because as I mentioned earlier, people can see only through one color or one side of the story. There is, I think a few years ago, I read a book. I was attracted to the title, The Complexity of the Simplicity. Okay, now we talk about all this, especially your generation now, anti-racist, equal justice, everything. When you choose a neighborhood to move, what kind of neighborhood you usually end up moving to? Or when because there is an inherent system where most of us or people of your generation, most of them, I'm not saying all. So all these, so will you be comfortable? So this is a question when you say we have to be anti-racist. Yes, I fully agree, but at the same time, will you be comfortable moving with your family to a high black neighborhood, high black in the sense numerically with a higher number of black people there? Will you be happy with the quality of life in that neighborhood? Will you be happy with the school system that you want to send your children to that neighborhood? So these are the questions. So where do you stand on that when it comes to our own anti-racism stand? So then the whole question, because it is very easy for us to say that I'm anti-racist. I can hug a black person on the street. But these are the questions. I still remember a few years ago, I saw a documentary film called, you might have come across that, Color of the, Fear of the Color, I think. So people, it's a documentary film where people just cross the road as soon as they see a black person. Because there is an inherent built-in color. So this is a struggle most of us have to go through. We are ideally and ideologically anti-racist on the one side. When it comes to our day-to-day life choices. How does it work out? Day-to-day life choices. What type of shops you end up shopping from? What type of neighborhood you end up living? What type of schools you choose? You might not be choosing because of the racial nature of the neighborhood, but because of the other choices you make, you end up being in a certain kind of neighborhood. Are you willing to risk the comfort and the security this kind of upper middle class, mostly white neighborhood gives you to be the anti-racist we all talk about? So that's why I said these are very serious, deep struggles each of us will have to go through.
Right. So here's a nice comment, I think. St. Gregorios in Washington State has members of many different colors and ethnicities, including African Americans.
Yeah.
The best way to achieve this is to simply invite your friends and neighbors to church and welcome them wholeheartedly. Also use more English in services so outsiders can learn and participate. Didimeni has been a great help to the mission in Spokane over the years. Thank you, Your Grace, for facilitating the discussion. May God be with our Black sisters and brothers, especially at this time. As we know, Very Reverend Hatcherutchin is doing a wonderful job out there. And I think that's probably a model for the rest of us in terms of what they're doing.
And I hope our St. Barnabas and St. Luke and St. Andrews will evolve into those kind of missions.
Right. So we're we've run about 15 minutes past the hour.
Okay.
I think we've addressed a lot of these issues. Frankly, a lot of these questions are questions that we could probably have an entire 1 hour discussion about. So I thank you for taking the time and putting some serious thought. Hopefully this is a conversation that allows us to have further conversations, further action. Look forward to hearing more about that, but I'd like to get your closing thoughts on that.
Yeah. Of course, thank you for being the host of this conversation. And I'm glad that because many of the things what I said or what we have discussed cannot be written in a kalpana, or because these things have to be shared in this kind of conversation. And also, I hope that I have initiated or provoked people enough to have some, I would say I have made some people uncomfortable with my statements, uncomfortable enough for them to think about it, and some people angry with regard to what kind of things Didimeni is saying, and some people happy because the church, I would say, includes all these kind of people. But the fact remains that this is a struggle each and every one of us have to address, and never look for others for them, because this is a personal struggle you have. You can look into the Bible for guidance. You can look into the church history. You can seek spiritual advice. But at the same time, take a personal responsibility of this struggle. And I hope this will be an ongoing struggle. This will not be an entertainment for the evening. Okay, we'll watch a Facebook Live. May God bless us all. Thank you for listening to me and Sunil for this time. Thank you. Thank you. And one last word, I think many of these conversations, we also come across as, because of the nature of incidents that provoked us, all of us are anti-police or something. We also want to pay respects to all those great police officers who are doing a great job protecting our communities all around the country. But at the same time, some irresponsible people are enough to spoil the whole thing. So thank you, and God bless us all. Good night.